It was late, too late for Sarah to still be out. Midnight had come and gone, and the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The kids had been asleep for hours, and I was sitting in the dark, a half-empty glass of whiskey sweating on the table in front of me. There was something different about this night, a tension that made my skin itch. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. I'd always trusted her. There wasn't a single moment in our 12 years together where I thought she'd ever give me a reason not to. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. There was this gnawing pit in my stomach, like I was waiting for the punchline of a joke that was about to tear my life apart. Earlier, I'd noticed she was more polished than usual. The makeup was heavier, her perfume stronger, and her dress, one she hadn't worn in years, hugged her curves a little too well for a quick dinner with friends. I could feel my hands tighten around the steering wheel when I dropped her off at the restaurant, but I forced a smile. "Have fun," I had said, watching her disappear into the dim lights of the place. I didn't drive away. I wish I had. God, I wish I hadn't sat there in my car, parked just far enough away so she wouldn't see me. But I stayed, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, my mind running wild with the endless possibilities of why my wife, the woman I'd built a life with, had been acting like a stranger for months. 30 minutes passed before I saw her walk out. She wasn't alone. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The man with her, his arm casually draped around her waist, pulling her close like he had every right to touch what was mine. I felt my chest tighten, the whiskey I'd downed earlier churning in my stomach as I watched them laugh, heads close together, completely oblivious to the world around them. I clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. I wanted to get out of the car, to confront her right there, but something stopped me. I needed more than just a confrontation in the parking lot. I needed to know how deep this betrayal went. So I followed them. They didn't go far, just a few blocks to some sleazy little motel that practically screamed infidelity. I watched them disappear inside without a second glance, without any hesitation. The whole time, my hands shook, my mind racing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But it was. The proof I needed came flooding in, and it hit harder than any punch I'd ever taken in my life. And now, sitting here, staring at the clock ticking past 2 a.m., I knew this was just the beginning of something much darker. When Sarah got home tonight, I would be waiting for her. But not like before. This time, I had everything I needed to bring her perfect little world crashing down. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her with him. His hands on her. Their bodies so close it made my skin crawl. I felt like I was suffocating. But beneath that was something else. Something cold and sharp. Revenge. I spent the next day in a daze, the clock ticking louder than it ever had before. Sarah wasn't due back until late again. Another one of her girls' nights. The audacity. After everything I saw, she still had the nerve to lie straight to my face like I was some fool. I'd been patient. Too patient. By noon, I had a plan. I knew I couldn't just confront her with words. Sarah was a master manipulator, twisting conversations until I felt like I was the one losing my grip on reality. This time, I wouldn't give her the chance. I needed something undeniable, something so concrete she wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. I thought about that motel, the disgusting betrayal hidden behind its cheap doors, and I knew exactly what I had to do. First, I called the private investigator. It was a low blow, I know, but I had to be sure. If I was going to confront her, I needed everything: times, dates, photos, the full package. The guy was good, too. Within hours, he had a folder ready for me. Apparently, this had been going on for months, not just with the guy I'd seen last night, but others before him. It was like being punched in the gut. Every photo a new wound that cut deeper than the last. But the worst part? I wasn't even surprised anymore. The rage had burned through my shock, leaving nothing but cold, methodical calculation. I printed out the photos, each one a knife I was ready to twist. Then I added something extra. A copy of the DNA test I'd gotten for our youngest son a few weeks ago. It had started as a nagging suspicion after hearing some offhand comment about how he didn't look like me. I tried to brush it off, but after everything I'd been seeing, I couldn't ignore it anymore. And the result? He wasn't mine. I almost threw up when I saw it. I'd been raising this boy as my own, pouring my heart into fatherhood, only to find out I'd been living a lie. But Sarah knew. She had to know, and that was the most unforgivable part. By the time evening rolled around, I had everything laid out neatly on the dining table. The photos, the DNA test, and the divorce papers I'd drawn up just this morning. I didn't want an explanation, an apology, or any of her pathetic excuses. I wanted her to face the truth of what she had done. The house was eerily quiet. I turned off the lights, leaving just a small lamp on in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. The clock ticked past midnight. I was ready, and then I heard it, the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, humming softly like she didn't have a care in the world. The smell of her perfume hit me like a slap to the face, sickly sweet and completely out of place in this moment. She froze when she saw me. I was sitting at the table, the evidence of her betrayal spread out in front of me like some twisted crime scene. I didn't say a word. I just watched her, waiting for her to make the first move, to see how deep her lies would go. Her eyes flicked from the papers to me, then back again. I could see the panic rising in her, but she tried to mask it with a smile, like this was all just some misunderstanding she could charm her way out of. "Hey, what's going on? Why are you up so late?" Her voice wavered, and I knew I had her. I didn't respond. Instead, I pushed the folder toward her, watching as she opened it with trembling hands. The photos hit her first. Pictures of her with the guy from last night, the cheap motel sign glaring in the background like a beacon of her infidelity. Her face went pale. But the DNA test, that was the knockout punch. When my wife got home, I was sitting at the table, waiting. I showed her the DNA test results and the divorce papers. "Let's see how you'll explain this to the kids and the judge." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, she didn't have a lie ready to spit out. I sat back in my chair, watching the web of deceit she'd woven slowly unravel before her very eyes. For a few moments, it was as if time had stopped. The only sound was the crinkling of paper as Sarah fumbled through the stack of evidence. Photos of her wrapped around some other man, the DNA test staring back at her like a cold, undeniable truth, and those divorce papers, sitting there like a final sentence. Her hand hovered over the DNA test, and I saw her eyes flinch when she finally read it. She looked up at me, her lips parted, but no words came out at first. The panic in her eyes quickly turned to something else. Defense, maybe. Desperation. But I wasn't going to give her room to wiggle out of this. "You have nothing to say?" I asked, my voice low, steady. My heart was pounding, but I refused to let her see that. Her breath hitched, and then it started, the spin, the manipulation. The thing she did so well. "This is ridiculous," she said, shaking her head as if I had just handed her a parking ticket. "Not the proof that our entire life was a lie. You seriously went through my stuff? Hired someone to follow me? I can't believe you do this to me." She laughed, but it was forced, sharp around the edges. "And a DNA test? Are you out of your mind?" I stared at her, feeling the anger burn hotter in my chest. She was really trying to flip this, to somehow make me the villain. The nerve of it. "Out of my mind?" I repeated, barely able to keep my voice in check. "You've been lying to me for God knows how long. And now you're going to make this about me?" Sarah straightened up, throwing the papers down on the table like they were nothing. Her face twisted into something unfamiliar, cold, angry. "Lying? No, you don't understand anything," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're paranoid. You've always been paranoid. If you were paying more attention to us instead of your little projects, maybe I wouldn't have felt so alone." I felt something snap inside me. Alone? That was her excuse? I could feel the blood rushing to my head, but I forced myself to stay calm, to not give her the satisfaction of knowing how deep her words were cutting. "I work to support this family, Sarah," I said, my voice sharper now. "I was there for you, for the kids. You're the one who checked out. You started pulling away, not me." She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms like a teenager caught breaking curfew. "Oh, give me a break," she spat. "You're not a saint. You act like everything was perfect, but you're always so boring, routine. I needed more than just being your wife, your housekeeper." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about some fling or even a one-time betrayal. This was deeper. She didn't just cheat. She resented me. She had been harboring this anger, this contempt, for years, and now it was spilling out, messy and cruel. So, that's it? I asked, incredulous. You destroy our family because you were bored? She let out a bitter laugh. Don't act so high and mighty. You weren't exactly exciting to be with, you know. Always the same, never any passion, no spontaneity. What was I supposed to do? Just sit here and rot while you played the perfect husband? The word stung like acid. I had spent years thinking I was building something solid, something that mattered, and now here she was, tearing it all down like it was worthless. Like I was worthless. But there was something else beneath her anger, fear. She didn't know how much I was willing to burn down now, and I could tell she wasn't ready for me to push back. You think this is all on me? I said, standing up from the table, forcing her to look me in the eyes. You think sleeping around with God knows how many guys is justified because I didn't take you on enough date nights? What kind of twisted logic is that? Sarah's face hardened, but I could see her walls cracking. The accusations she'd thrown at me were starting to feel hollow, even to her. It wasn't like that, she muttered, looking away. You don't understand. No, I understand perfectly. I shot back. You didn't just lie, Sarah. You made a fool out of me, out of us. You let me believe our son was mine. Let me raise him, love him, while you… Stop, she interrupted, her voice shaking now, but it wasn't regret in her eyes. It was fear. Fear of losing control. We can fix this. We can. Fix it. I cut her off, laughing bitterly. You can't fix this. This isn't some argument we sweep under the rug. You lied to me, to our kids, and you expect me to just, what? Forget it? Pretend like none of this ever happened. Her eyes darted to the divorce papers again, and I could see the reality sinking in. She was starting to realize this wasn't a game. This wasn't one of those times where she could bat her eyes and make everything go back to the way it was. You don't want to do this, she whispered, her voice barely audible now. Think about the kids. Think about… I slammed my hand down on the table, making her jump. Don't you dare bring the kids into this. You didn't think about them when you were sneaking around behind my back. Did you? You didn't think about them when you were lying to me about who their father is. Her face paled, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She wasn't just afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing everything. But I didn't care anymore. I took a deep breath, staring her down, my voice steady now. You made this bed, Sarah. Now lie in it. The silence between us was thick, almost suffocating. Sarah stood there, her eyes wide, lips parted like she was searching for words that wouldn't come. I could see it now, clearly, her desperation. She wasn't the confident, manipulative woman who thought she could twist everything to her advantage anymore. She was unraveling, and it was almost satisfying to watch. But then, like a switch flipped, she changed again. Her face hardened, the panic replaced by something nastier. Cold calculation. She tilted her head, narrowing her eyes at me, like she had finally made a decision about how to play this. It was like she'd dropped the act, the last of the masks she'd worn for years. You really think you're going to walk away from this without paying a price? Her voice was low, venomous, and for a second, I couldn't believe how quickly she had turned. There was no more pleading, no more fear in her eyes, just pure, cold rage. You're not as smart as you think you are, Nick. I blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift. What are you talking about? She stepped closer, crossing her arms over her chest, and let out a bitter laugh. You think waving those papers in my face is going to scare me? You're not walking away from this clean. Oh no. She leaned in, her voice dripping with venom. I've been planning for this. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something about the way she said it, so deliberate, like she had been waiting for this moment. Planning for what? I asked, narrowing my eyes, trying to stay calm. You don't get to spin this. You've been lying to me, cheating. You think you have the upper hand here. Sarah smirked. It wasn't a normal smirk. It was cruel, twisted. You think you're going to show the judge those photos? The DNA test? You think that's enough to get rid of me? Oh, Nick, you have no idea how this game works. She shrugged, casually, like she was explaining something simple. I've been preparing for this for months. I've got everything documented. Every time you lost your temper, every time you were too busy, for the kids, every argument. I've kept every text, every email, and guess what? I even recorded a few of our more heated discussions. I felt the blood drain from my face. What are you talking about? She took another step forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. You're not going to win this. I'll take everything. The house, the kids, your precious reputation. And when I'm done, you'll be the one explaining yourself to the judge, not me. It was like I'd been punched in the gut. I knew Sarah could be manipulative, but this was something else. I had always thought her lies were careless, impulsive. But now I realized she had been playing a long game, one I never even knew I was in. You're bluffing, I said. But the words felt weak, hollow. There was a part of me that knew she wasn't. I'd underestimated her. Badly. She smiled, and it made my skin crawl. You think I'm bluffing? Go ahead. File those papers. See what happens. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be lucky if you get to see the kids on weekends. I'll paint you as the distant father, the neglectful husband, the one who was too focused on his work to care about his family. I stood there, staring at her, trying to process what was happening. How had it come to this? How had I let this person, this stranger, sit across from me, live with me, share a bed with me for all these years? I thought I was angry before, but now the rage was different. Deeper. It wasn't just about the cheating anymore. It was about everything. You really think you can just rewrite history like that? I asked, my voice low, steady. You think you can make me out to be the bad guy and walk away with everything? She shrugged again, like this was just business as usual. People believe what they want to believe, Nick. And trust me, I'll make sure they believe me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just some affair. This was a full-scale betrayal, calculated and deliberate. She had been setting me up, waiting for the moment to drop the hammer and destroy me, not just personally but legally. I glanced at the divorce papers on the table. Suddenly, they felt like nothing more than pieces of paper in the face of what she was threatening. She was ready to turn this whole thing on its head, to twist the narrative so completely that I'd be the one fighting for scraps. But then, something clicked in me. A strange, calm feeling washed over me. I had been playing defense this whole time, reacting to her moves, letting her control the situation. But not anymore. I wasn't going to let her bulldoze me with her lies and threats. You might have your little recordings, Sarah, I said, straightening up, my voice cold. But let me tell you something. Those kids, they're old enough to know what's going on. You think you're going to drag them into this and spin your lies to the court? Fine. But they know who's been there for them, who's been the stable one. They know who really cares. She blinked, her smirk faltering for just a moment. I pressed on. And that DNA test is going to make its way into court whether you like it or not. You can scream and manipulate all you want, but facts don't lie. You think you can convince everyone I'm the bad guy, but that's going to stick with you. You didn't just cheat. You let me raise a kid that isn't mine. That's not going away. For the first time, I saw her confidence waver. Her face twitched, just slightly, but it was enough for me to know I'd hit a nerve. You want a war, Sarah? I said, my voice cold, steady. Fine, let's have a war. But don't think for a second you're going to walk away from this untouched. Her eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't have a response. Not yet, anyway. I'm done with your lies, I said, turning my back on her. We'll let the court decide who's the villain here. As I walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, I knew things were far from over. This was just the beginning of the storm. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The house felt wrong, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and vicious threats. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah's cold, manipulative voice echoing in my mind. You're not going to win this. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smirk, her confidence, her twisted satisfaction that she had the upper hand. Morning came too soon, the sunlight slicing through the blinds, sharp and unwelcome. I didn't bother to wake Sarah. I had no interest in seeing her face. Instead, I grabbed my phone, made a few calls, and set the pieces in motion. If she wanted war, I wasn't going to sit back and let her destroy me. By noon, I was meeting with my lawyer, A bulldog of a woman named Jessica who didn't flinch when I laid everything out. The affair, the DNA test, the recordings Sarah had supposedly made. I watched her scribble notes furiously as I spoke, her expression unreadable until I finished. Then she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "Nick, this is bad," she said bluntly, her voice flat. "But it's not as bad as she wants you to believe." I frowned, leaning forward. "She's got recordings, Jess. She's been planning this for months. She wants to paint me as the neglectful father, the distant husband. And we're going to make sure that doesn't happen," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But first things first. The DNA test? That's going to blow everything up in court. No judge is going to overlook that. You've been raising a child under false pretenses. That's a huge point in your favor, especially with custody. Courts don't take kindly to paternity fraud." I exhaled, the weight of that knowledge settling in. At least that was something. But Sarah's threats still lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. "What about the recordings?" I asked. "If she's got something that makes me look unstable or—" "Don't worry about the recordings," Jessica interrupted, shaking her head. "In most cases, secretly recording conversations in your own home without your knowledge is illegal. If she tries to use them in court, we'll shut that down fast." For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. I had been so caught up in Sarah's threats, I hadn't even considered that she might be bluffing, or at least overplaying her hand. But this was far from over. "We need to build a strong case," Jessica continued, her tone all business. "Document everything, every text, every email. Start keeping track of her behavior, especially with the kids. You need to show the court that you're the stable parent. That's going to be key in getting custody." I nodded, feeling the resolve settle into my bones. I wasn't going to let Sarah drag me down without a fight. And if she thought she could walk away from this untouched, she was dead wrong. By the time I left the lawyer's office, my mind was buzzing with strategies and plans. I had underestimated Sarah once, but never again. This wasn't just about our broken marriage anymore. It was about survival, about protecting my kids from the mess she had created. When I got home, the house was quiet. Sarah was in the living room, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. The sight of her, so casual, so comfortable, made my blood boil. How could she just sit there, pretending everything was normal after what she'd done? I walked past her without a word, heading upstairs to the bedroom. I needed to clear my head to figure out my next move. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard her voice, sharp and cutting. "So, how was your meeting with the lawyer?" I stopped, my hand tightening on the banister. Of course she knew. She was always one step ahead, always watching, waiting for the moment to twist the knife. I turned slowly, meeting her gaze. "It went well," I said, my voice cold. "We'll see what the judge thinks of your little games." Sarah didn't flinch. In fact, she smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that made my stomach churn. "You really think you can beat me in court, Nick? You don't know how deep this goes." I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I didn't let it show. "I know enough, and I know that the DNA test alone is enough to rip your story apart." Her smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly, standing up from the couch. "You think that's going to save you? You're so predictable, always thinking facts are enough. But this isn't about facts. It's about perception. And trust me, I'll make sure everyone sees you for what you really are." I clenched my fists, the rage bubbling up again. "You're delusional if you think you're going to walk away from this without consequences." She shrugged, unfazed. "We'll see." I stared at her, my heart pounding, knowing there was no reasoning with her anymore. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the Sarah I had married. She was a stranger, a manipulator who had been playing a long con, and now the mask had fully slipped. I turned to walk away, but her next words stopped me cold. "Oh, and Nick," she called, her voice dripping with mockery. "Don't get too comfortable. Things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. For you, anyway." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Every part of me wanted to scream, to lash out, but I knew that's what she wanted. She wanted me to lose control, to give her the ammunition she needed to twist the story even further. So instead, I walked away, back upstairs, back to the quiet of my room, where I could think, plan, and steel myself for what was coming next. Because I knew, without a doubt, the storm wasn't over. It had barely begun. The days after that conversation with Sarah felt like a strange kind of calm before a storm, a tense, unsettling quiet. Every time I saw her, every time we exchanged those brief, cold glances, it felt like we were circling each other, waiting for the first real blow to land. I knew she was plotting, waiting for her moment to strike. What I didn't expect was how fast and brutal her first move would be. It started early in the morning. I was in the kitchen, getting breakfast ready for the kids before school, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for their sake. They had no idea what was going on. Thank God for that. Sarah had always been good at keeping up appearances, and lately, she had been playing the doting mother, overcompensating to make sure they saw her as perfect. It was sickening. The kids were upstairs getting ready, and I was pouring coffee when I heard Sarah's footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. I wasn't in the mood for another one of her mind games this early in the morning. But when she spoke, her voice was dripping with fake sweetness, a tone I hadn't heard from her in a long time. "Good morning, Nick. I hope you're ready for what's coming." I set the coffee pot down, my hand tightening around the handle. "What are you talking about now?" She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper, but I could feel the venom in every word. "I filed a restraining order against you. It's already in place. By the time you come home tonight, you won't be allowed anywhere near this house." The words hit me like a freight train. I spun around to face her, my heart racing. "You what?" Her smile widened, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the joy she took in seeing my reaction. "You heard me. I told the court that you've been emotionally unstable, that you've been threatening me, and that the kids aren't safe around you." Couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the reality of what she was saying sank in. A restraining order? Against me? I had never laid a hand on her or the kids, never threatened her. Nothing. This was her move, the first strike in a game I didn't even know the rules to. "You're lying," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You can't do this. There's no proof." "I don't need proof," she interrupted, her eyes glinting with triumph. "Not when I have a documented history of you losing your temper. Remember those recordings I told you about? The ones where you're yelling, getting angry? The judge didn't need to hear much more than that." I felt sick. All those times I had raised my voice, frustrated by her constant manipulation, her gaslighting. It had all been twisted into something I didn't even recognize. She had been setting this up for months, maybe years, waiting for the moment to pull the trigger. "I'll fight this," I said, my voice steadier now. "You won't get away with it." "Oh, I'm counting on it," she said, leaning in so close I could feel her breath on my skin. "But by the time you fight it, I'll have full custody of the kids, the house, everything. You'll be lucky if you can see them at all." For a moment I couldn't speak. The sheer audacity of her plan, the cold calculation behind it, left me stunned. This wasn't just about ruining our marriage. This was about erasing me from my own life, taking everything I had built, everything I cared about, and leaving me with nothing. "How could you do this to the kids?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They need both of us. They deserve better than this." Her expression didn't change. "They'll be fine. Better off, actually, without your temper and your controlling ways." I felt the anger boiling inside me again, but I knew if I exploded now, it would only feed into her narrative. She wanted me to lose it to give her more ammunition. I couldn't afford to play into her hands. I needed to stay calm, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to fight back, to tear down the lies she was building. "Fine," I said, stepping back, forcing myself to stay composed. "But you won't win. Not like this." She shrugged, completely unfazed. "We'll see." And then, as if nothing had happened, she turned on her heel and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, stunned, my mind reeling from what she had just dropped on me. I didn't know how much time I had left before the police would show up at the door, ready to enforce the restraining order. I didn't know if I'd get to see my kids before I was forced out of the house. But I did know one thing. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was a full-blown war, and Sarah had no limits to what she would do to win. The rest of the day was a blur. I called Jessica, my lawyer, immediately after Sarah left. Her response was exactly what I expected. Sharp, focused, and ready for battle. "We need to move fast," she said. "I'll file a motion to contest the restraining order. But in the meantime, you need to stay calm. Don't give her anything she can use against you. No contact. No arguments. Nothing." It was easier said than done. That night, I packed a small bag, watching the minutes tick by, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door. I wanted to say goodbye to my kids, to explain why I wouldn't be there when they woke up the next morning. But Sarah made sure they stayed upstairs, out of sight. She knew I wouldn't risk a confrontation. When the officers arrived, it was surreal. They were polite, almost apologetic, but there was no room for argument. I had to leave. I looked back at the house as I walked to my car, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on me. My home, my family, my life. Sarah had ripped it all away in one calculated move. As I drove away, the road stretching out ahead of me like some long, lonely tunnel, I felt the full force of her betrayal hit me. This was just the beginning, and I had no idea how far she was willing to go. But I did know one thing. She had just made her biggest mistake. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. That night, I didn't go far. Couldn't. Driving around aimlessly felt like a bad dream where everything you knew and loved had been ripped out from under you. But you couldn't wake up. I ended up in a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where you could smell the mildew before you even opened the door. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was just like the one Sarah had snuck off to with her latest fling. Now, here I was, the one exiled to a filthy, forgotten corner of town. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Sarah had done it. She'd thrown the first real punch in this war, and I hadn't seen it coming. A restraining order. She had painted me as some kind of violent, unstable man, all because she had secretly recorded a few heated arguments. The realization that every time I'd raised my voice in frustration, she had been collecting evidence to use against me made my skin crawl. I texted Jessica to update her. She was quick to respond, laying out the next steps like she was reading off a battle plan. "Jessica, we'll fight this, but you need to stay quiet for now. No contact with Sarah. Don't go near the house. I'll push for an emergency hearing to contest the order, but it could take a few days. In the meantime, stay out of trouble." It was good advice, but the idea of staying away, letting Sarah twist things even further, was unbearable. I felt like I was being erased, pushed out of my own life, while she continued to manipulate the kids and everyone around her. By the next morning, reality hit even harder. I woke up to a string of missed calls from my friends, even a couple of texts from coworkers, all asking the same thing. Is it true? Sarah hadn't wasted any time. She was telling people, our people, that I'd been kicked out of the house because I was unstable, that I had scared her and the kids, and this was for everyone's safety. I could feel the bile rise in my throat as I scrolled through the messages. She was crafting her narrative, painting me as the villain, and by the time I got my day in court, who knew how much damage would already be done? I clenched my phone, the plastic creaking under the pressure of my grip. How could she do this? How could she weaponize my life, my relationships, against me? I thought back to what she'd said the night before, how this wasn't about facts, it was about perception. I had always believed the truth would be enough, but now I wasn't so sure. Sarah was winning the perception battle, and I was already 2 steps behind. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a drive. I couldn't sit in that motel room any longer without going crazy. I didn't know where I was going until I found myself parked a few blocks away from my house. Our house. I shouldn't have been there, but I needed to see it. I needed to remind myself of what I was fighting for. From where I was parked, I could see the front door, the driveway where the kids' bikes were still lying haphazardly on the grass. I felt a lump in my throat, remembering how many times I'd watched them ride up and down that driveway, laughing, racing each other. And now I was just a stranger in their lives. I hadn't seen them since the night before, and the thought of Sarah poisoning them against me made my stomach churn. As I sat there, watching the house, I saw the door open. My heart leapt for a second, thinking it might be the kids. But no, it was Sarah. She stepped out, looking like she didn't have a care in the world, talking on her phone, laughing softly at something. It took every ounce of self-control not to get out of the car and confront her. But I couldn't. That's exactly what she wanted, to push me, to make me snap so she could use it against me. She spotted me. Her eyes locked onto mine through the windshield, and for a brief moment, her expression changed. There was a flicker of surprise, maybe even fear. But then, just as quickly, her face hardened. She raised her phone and waved it in the air, as if to say, "Go ahead. Give me a reason to call the cops." I stayed frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. She smirked, then turned and walked back into the house, slamming the door behind her. I drove away, my heart pounding in my chest, a mix of rage and helplessness bubbling inside me. She had me cornered, and she knew it. Every step I took was being watched, recorded, twisted. She was pulling the strings, and I was the one dancing to her tune. But I couldn't let her win. Not like this. I spent the next few days laying low, avoiding any contact with Sarah and trying to get my head straight. Jessica was working hard, trying to fast-track the hearing, but it felt like time was crawling. Every minute I spent away from my kids was torture. Couldn't even call them. Sarah had cut off all contact. The court order was clear: no communication. No explanations. Just silence. The worst part was the not knowing. What was she telling them? Were they asking about me? Did they think I had abandoned them? The thought of my kids believing I had just walked out on them, left them without a word, was unbearable. I couldn't sit back and wait for the courts to fix this. I had to do something. That's when I got an idea. It was risky, but I didn't have much to lose at this point. Sarah had made sure of that. If I couldn't see my kids in person, if I couldn't talk to them on the phone, I'd find another way. I started writing them letters. Not long, emotional letters that would overwhelm them, but simple ones, explaining that I loved them, that I missed them, and that I was doing everything I could to come home. I made sure not to say anything that could be twisted in court. I didn't need Sarah using my own words against me. I mailed the first one that day, unsure if it would even reach them. Sarah would probably intercept it, but at least I was trying. I couldn't just disappear from their lives, not without a fight. By the end of the week, Jessica had finally set a date for the hearing. It wasn't as soon as I had hoped, but it was a start. She warned me it was going to be a battle. Sarah was prepared, and she had already begun painting me as the monster in the story she was telling. But what Sarah didn't know was that I was prepared, too. The photos, the DNA test, the private investigators' reports, I had everything. Sarah thought she had control of the narrative, but she had underestimated me. This wasn't just about playing defense anymore. It was time for me to strike back. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and the tension was unbearable. Every step I took felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of what waited on the other side. Jessica had prepped me for everything. What to say, how to act, how to stay calm no matter what lies Sarah threw my way. But no amount of preparation could calm the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I showed up at the courthouse early, dressed in a suit that felt a little too stiff, trying to steady my nerves. The hearing wasn't going to be a full trial, but it was the first real battle in what would undoubtedly be a long, ugly war. We were there to address the restraining order and lay the groundwork for the divorce. In that courtroom, Sarah would finally have to face the truth. I'd make sure of it. As I walked through the doors, my heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea what she'd pull today, what kind of lies she'd spin, how far she'd go to paint me as the villain in front of the judge. I tried not to think about it, tried to focus on what I had. The DNA test, the photos, the proof of her infidelity. It was solid evidence, and Jessica had assured me it would be enough to expose her manipulations. But still, the uncertainty gnawed at me. I couldn't predict what Sarah would do. She was always one step ahead, always twisting reality to suit her narrative. I sat in the hallway waiting. The minutes crawled by, every sound magnified. The clinking of heels on the floor, the low murmur of voices, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. And then I saw her, Sarah. She walked into the courthouse like she owned the place, her face calm and composed, dressed in a sleek, dark outfit that made her look almost regal. The same smirk played on her lips, the same cold confidence radiating from her. It was like she had already decided the outcome of the day, like none of this fazed her. But then I noticed something else. Her lawyer, a guy I hadn't seen before. Young, slick, the kind of attorney who specialized in dirty tricks. Jessica had warned me that Sarah would come prepared, but seeing it was a different story. This wasn't going to be a simple hearing. Sarah had loaded her weapons, and she was ready to go for the jugular. The bailiff called us in, and the moment I stepped into that courtroom, I could feel the gravity of the situation settle over me like a thick, suffocating weight. The judge sat high on his bench, stern and impassive, while Sarah's lawyer quickly launched into his argument. He painted a picture of me that I didn't even recognize. A man who was emotionally unstable, prone to fits of anger, who posed a danger to his own family. He spoke about documented incidents of me raising my voice, of Sarah feeling trapped and afraid in her own home. He even referenced the recordings Sarah had supposedly made, twisting them into some narrative of emotional abuse. I sat there, clenching my fists under the table, my heart racing. Jessica had told me to expect this, but hearing it in that sterile courtroom, with Sarah sitting there, playing the victim, was more than I could bear. Every word felt like a dagger, each one digging deeper into the life I thought I knew. Jessica was ready, though. When it was our turn, she stood up, cool and composed, and laid out our side of the story. She went straight for the truth. She presented the DNA test, laying it in front of the judge like a bomb ready to go off. She explained how Sarah had been cheating, how she had manipulated me into believing our youngest son was mine, all while carrying on with other men behind my back. The judge's expression shifted slightly when he saw the test results, and I could feel the tension shift in the room. Jessica wasn't finished. She brought up the private investigator's report, times, dates, and photos of Sarah sneaking around, meeting with her lovers. Every piece of evidence was like a hammer blow to the perfect image Sarah had tried to create. For the first time, I saw her face change. The confidence cracked, just a little. Her smirk faltered, and for a second, I saw fear flash in her eyes. But her lawyer was quick to recover. He brushed off the DNA test like it was irrelevant, focusing instead on their narrative of emotional abuse. He painted Sarah as the victim of my supposed anger, claiming that she had felt trapped in the marriage, forced to lie out of fear for her safety and the kids. I watched the judge closely, trying to gauge where he stood. His face was unreadable, but he listened carefully to both sides, his eyes flicking back and forth between Jessica and Sarah's lawyer. I knew it wasn't going to be as simple as just showing the evidence. Sarah's lawyer was good, twisting every fact into something that suited their story. And then, it was my turn to speak. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and took a deep breath. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on me. I looked at the judge, then at Sarah, who was staring at me with that same cold indifference, like she already knew what I was going to say. "I'm not a perfect man," I began, my voice steady but firm. "I've made mistakes, but I've never hurt my wife and I've never hurt my kids. I raised them, loved them, and gave everything I had to this family. What's happening here today isn't about emotional abuse. It's about manipulation. Sarah lied to me for years, about her affairs, about our son's paternity. She deceived me, and now she's trying to use those lies to destroy my relationship with my children." I could feel the weight of every word, feel the truth hanging in the air between us. Sarah's eyes narrowed, but I didn't back down. "I have never been a danger to my family," I continued, "and I refuse to be erased from my children's lives because of her lies. The DNA test, the photos, the reports, it's all here. This is the truth." The judge nodded, scribbling notes as I spoke, his expression thoughtful. I could feel the tide turning, but I knew this was far from over. Sarah wasn't going to back down without a fight. She was too deeply entrenched in her narrative, too committed to tearing me apart. When the hearing finally ended, the judge said he needed time to review everything before making a decision on the restraining order. He wanted to see more evidence from both sides, more clarity on the paternity issue, and more proof about Sarah's claims of emotional abuse. It wasn't the slam dunk I had hoped for, but it wasn't a loss either. It was the beginning of the endgame. As we left the courtroom, Sarah shot me one last look, a mixture of anger and something else. Fear, maybe, or was it hatred? I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that the next battle was looming, and it was going to be even uglier than this. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. Sarah wasn't untouchable. She wasn't invincible. And now, finally, she was starting to realize it. The days after the hearing felt like standing on a cliff's edge, waiting for the ground to either crumble beneath me or hold steady. The judge hadn't made a decision yet, but the fact that he hadn't outright sided with Sarah gave me hope. That hope, however, came with a price. I knew the final battle was coming, and it wasn't going to be pretty. I spent most of my time holed up in the same cheap motel, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling out of control. Jessica was on top of things, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. I kept imagining what Sarah was telling the kids, how she was twisting everything to make me the villain in their eyes. That thought alone was enough to drive me insane. One evening, just as I was sitting down to another sad excuse for dinner, I got a text. It wasn't from Jessica, though. I recognized the number immediately. It was Sarah's mother, Ellen. She had always been civil with me, never fully taking sides, even when things started unraveling. But this text wasn't the usual polite check-in. It was short and cryptic. "Ellen, we need to talk. I think it's time you know something." My heart raced. I had no idea what she was referring to, but the urgency in her message told me it was important. Without hesitation, I called her back. She answered almost immediately. "Nick," she said, her voice low, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago, but I didn't think it was my place. Now, after everything that's happening, I can't keep quiet anymore." I gripped the phone tighter. "What is it, Ellen?" She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Sarah's been seeing a therapist for years, but not for the reasons she's been telling everyone." I blinked. "What do you mean?" Ellen sighed, and I could hear the weight of years of silence in that breath. "Sarah's therapist wasn't for anxiety or stress. She's been diagnosed with a personality disorder, Nick. Borderline personality disorder, to be exact. It explains a lot of what she's been doing." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to process what Ellen had just said. Personality disorder? That was a term I'd heard thrown around in casual conversation, but hearing it tied to Sarah, the woman I had lived with, the mother of my children, it was like a puzzle piece clicking into place. The manipulation, the erratic behavior, the lies, it all suddenly made sense. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. "I didn't know if it would help," Ellen admitted, her voice soft. "And Sarah begged me not to say anything. She didn't want you to think less of her. But now, I can't stay silent while she's dragging you through hell. You deserve to know the full story." The full story. Suddenly, the years of emotional manipulation, the unpredictable mood swings, the way she could turn from loving to cruel in the blink of an eye, they all fit a pattern. And now, with this new information, I had something that might turn the tide. I thanked Ellen and hung up, my mind racing. I immediately called Jessica to tell her what I had learned. She was silent for a moment, clearly considering how to use this revelation. "This changes things," Jessica said, her tone thoughtful. "We can use this to challenge her credibility. If Sarah's been hiding a mental health condition from the court, especially one that directly affects her behavior, it's a game changer. But we need proof." Proof. I knew that would be the key. It wasn't enough to just claim she had a disorder. Jessica needed records, something concrete that could be submitted to the court. And that meant finding Sarah's therapist. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and sleepless nights. Jessica worked fast, tracking down Sarah's therapist and securing a subpoena for the records. It wasn't easy. Sarah's lawyer fought back hard, claiming the information was private and irrelevant. But the judge saw it differently. He agreed that if Sarah's mental health was a factor in her behavior and decision-making, the court had a right to know. When the day of the final hearing came, I felt different, stronger, armed with the truth in a way I hadn't been before. This wasn't just about the lies Sarah had told or the games she had played. It was about the truth of who she was, the battle she had been fighting within herself, and how that had bled into every corner of our lives. The courtroom was tense. Sarah sat across from me, her face pale but defiant. Her lawyer was smooth as ever, launching into the same tired arguments about me being a threat, about her being the victim. But this time, Jessica was ready. She stood up, calm and composed, and laid it all out. The DNA test, the affairs, the restraining order built on manipulation. And then, she dropped the bombshell, the records from Sarah's therapist. For the first time, I saw real panic in Sarah's eyes. She hadn't expected this. No one had. Jessica explained Sarah's diagnosis, how her condition affected her behavior, her relationships, her ability to make sound decisions. The judge listened carefully, his eyes flicking between Jessica, Sarah, and me. Sarah's lawyer tried to object, claiming it was a violation of privacy, that it had nothing to do with the case. But Jessica was relentless. She argued that Sarah's mental health directly impacted her ability to be the stable parent she claimed to be, and that the court needed to consider all factors when determining custody and the validity of the restraining order. When Jessica finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge sat back in his chair, his face stern, considering everything he had just heard. Sarah sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, her perfect mask finally cracking. The judge spoke slowly, methodically, and I hung on every word. He acknowledged the complexity of the case, the emotions involved, but in the end, he made one thing clear. The restraining order was being lifted. I was no longer barred from my home, and I would have immediate access to my children. The custody battle was far from over, but this was a major victory. Sarah didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the table in front of her, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Sarah's power over me, over the narrative she had built, was crumbling. Outside, Jessica turned to me with a rare smile. "We're not done yet," she said. "But this was huge." I nodded, finally allowing myself to breathe. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could see a future. A future where I wasn't the villain in Sarah's story. A future where I could rebuild my life. Where I could be with my kids without the shadow of her lies hanging over me. As I drove away from the courthouse, I thought about everything I had learned. About Sarah, about myself, about the twisted reality we had lived in for years. But I had survived. And now it was time to start picking up the pieces and move forward. Because no matter how hard Sarah tried to break me, she had underestimated one thing. I was done playing her game, and I wasn't going anywhere.